Really lovely to be here with you today, and I've no idea who's online, but hello, and it's lovely to have you here. Siobhan's already done an introduction, but I just want to, I suppose, start with a thanks to the All Ireland Network on Sexual Violence Research and the Centre for Children's Rights here at Queen's for inviting me to do this today and doing all the logistical work of getting it set up. I'm just delighted I don't have to deal with the IT side of things, and it's great really to have the chance to kind of be here. Siobhan has already kind of introduced me, and I suppose today feels like a lovely sense of different parts of my world coming together. Siobhan said there about kind of 25 years of research, and actually that was, I did my PhD here in Queen's 25 years ago, and I've just bumped into Michael, who does his PhD at the same time as me, and Brona at the same time too. So it's really lovely to kind of see some of these worlds come together and to be able to just kind of share these experiences with you today. I suppose to start, why are we particularly focusing on children and young people's experiences of criminal justice processes following sexual abuse? Well, for me, the reason we first started working in this field is actually a group of children and young people that we'd been working with and had engaged in other projects. When we asked them, what do you want us to be looking at? We were going to pitch for a bit of internal money from the University of Bedfordshire, where I was at the time. This was their key priority. They talked about how distressing and re-traumatizing the process could be. And this was what they really wanted us to look into and to try to make things better around. So that's how myself and my colleague Camille Warrington, who's been involved in all the studies that I'm talking about today, kind of came to this field of work. And when we came to this field of work, we realized that actually there was very little there about children and young people's experiences. There was a lot about what we as professionals thought their experiences were, but very little actually in their words and really getting to the heart of what was important to them. So that's the kind of context of what I share today, is even now, there is a limited body of research with children and young people, and I'm going to try my best to not rant my way through this slide because I do feel very passionate around this. There's lots of reasons for this. Hierarchies of knowledge. We don't actually value children and young people's perspectives as much as we value adults or we value professionals. And also then they have this kind of, they're in a double bind where we say, well, you're vulnerable because of your age or your developmental capacity. And that applies to all children. But then, oh my goodness, add on top of that you have experienced harm. You must be so vulnerable and so damaged that we can't possibly engage you in this work. And I think that is an incredibly unhelpful message for us to give to children and young people. It reinforces the stigma around experiencing abuse, the silencing that we know often happens to them and to anyone who has experienced this, and that sense of shame. And so for us, it's incredibly important that we push back. And absolutely, we don't do it lightly. It needs really careful consideration, but that we do lean into how do we do this work. And we are here in the Centre for Children's Rights. And it's obviously also really important because at the most basic of levels, it denies children their Article 12 UNCRC right to have a say about matters that affect them. And it also denies them the potential benefits of being involved in work that can start to make a difference. And we repeatedly hear from children and young people when we ask for feedback of how they experience taking part in work or other work that they've taken part in, actually how empowering and how important it is to them to be able to use something that's been a really negative, that feels like such an understatement, experience in their life, but to try to get something positive out of it and bring about positive change for other people. And if we don't give them those spaces, we deny them that. I apologise, I have a bit of a cold, so hopefully I'll make my way through it. Really importantly though too, it actually denies us the opportunity to understand and respond to their experiences and their needs. And we have to do that if we are to appropriately respond. It's not just an adult filtered lens of what they need. It's what do they need at that moment in time? What are their priorities? How can we respond? And whilst there's a really important role for research with adult survivors of sexual abuse, and this is not in any way diminishing it, it is not the whole picture. Because when we look back retrospectively, we do so through the lens of an adult mind and the passage of time. And actually, we also need alongside that what's it like in the moment when you are still a child. And there's lots of work has been going on around kind of improving criminal justice processes around adults' experiences of sexual violence. We've Operation Soteria, for example, in England, and there's really great stuff coming out of that. But again, it's not as simple as going, oh, great, that'll apply to children and young people too, because actually it needs nuanced and it needs change to fit their developmental stage and their experiences. So I suppose that's kind of the context to what I'm sharing today. And as Siobhan said when she introduced me, I'm not presenting on any one study today. I'm presenting on kind of the key themes that have emerged from a body of research around this. And that's, we've done kind of 7 different research projects. We've some projects that weren't research as well, over the last approximately 10 years. And they've been mostly qualitative or mixed methods. Some involve surveys. And they have, as Siobhan said, they've involved over 200 children and young people from the ages of 6 upwards. And although they have taken place over a time period of just over 10 years, and although they've taken place in different geographical contexts, some were England only, some were UK-wide, included Northern Ireland, there are remarkably consistent themes that come out time and time again. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. You will get a copy of the slides, and you have here kind of the links to all the studies that I'm going to draw on today. I'll highlight the last one here, which wasn't a research study, but we had funding to do what we called the CSE and Policing Knowledge Hub. I think 2014 to 2017, possibly. No, there we go, 2015 to 2018. I had it in my notes. And there was a lovely project as part of that led by my colleague Fiona Factor, which brought together young people and police to say, yeah, doesn't really work. There's problems. What might the solutions be? And I put a link there to a lovely infographic, a poster that they created that went to all police forces in England, and you can download it, which is just that these are the ways in which you can try to make this process better. But in terms of the research that I'm going to share today, I just want to thank all my co-authors. They are all listed here. I'm not going to name them all because it will take too long, but to thank them. I did most of this work when I was working at the University of Bedfordshire. I was there for 12 years and then just changed to UCLan last year. And we had the most amazing Young Researchers Advisory Panel there who actually worked with us on developing bids, how we did the research, how we disseminated it. We've just set up a wonderful one at UCLan, which I'm very excited about. But I have to really thank them for their support of all of this work. And they were some of the people who started us on this journey. Obviously, kind of advisory group members who've supported us. Absolutely, most importantly, the child and youth participants, but also the organisations who supported their involvement. And I had a methodology slide and I removed it because I knew I talked far too much about this. I'm really happy to talk about our approach afterwards. But a key part of that was that young people were engaged through services who could help kind of assess the kind of needs and potential risks and provide the wraparound support. So we couldn't have done this work without their support as well. I want to start, if I can ask Siobhan, because my IT skills are dreadful, and I hope this works online. This is about what children and young people want to tell us, and it is in the context of abuse. So I want to start by showing a video that a group of young people who worked with us on the Making Noise piece of research around experiences of familial sexual abuse created for professionals. What they want you to hear about what it's like after this experience as our context for them thinking about criminal justice.
We are children and young people from the Making Noise project.
And we want to show you what it can feel like for a young person going through this journey.
But remember, every young person is different. No one's experience is the same.
When you're a child and you're abused, you don't know what's happened and you don't know who you should tell because you're scared and you're confused.
For a child, no matter what age, to say the actual thing, attacked, raped, assaulted, abused, it's very hard because you're young. You don't want to know those words. You don't want to tell your mother.
You don't want to tell anyone, so you stay quiet about it and you're trapped. Your feelings are trapped inside you and you don't know what to do. It's as if you've locked yourself in a prison.
Eventually I did tell my mum, and I was so worried she wouldn't believe me. But she did, and then we went to the GP. This is where the whole journey began, really.
Well, after you've told the first person, it gets much easier to tell the second and third. So long as the first person is nice and listens, then you know you don't need to be embarrassed. When I had to go and see the police, I worried that they would tell everybody, and I didn't want the whole world to know.
My police officer was funny and he was understanding, but just when you find one you can trust, they suddenly go off the radar. Then you're stuck with the people you feel like you can't talk to.
You feel like people are going to judge you? People are going to look at you differently?
I had to do the video evidence, where they record everything. I don't know if that was more traumatising than the actual abuse I went through. I thought, it's literally like the whole thing's happening again.
It's like a couple months before court, and you feel like it's going to take forever. But then like 2 weeks before, it feels like it's moving at 1,000 miles an hour. I was terrified to go to court.
Adults would talk to me like I was a baby and be on their tiptoes around me. Children don't want to be classed as one. They want to be classed as a human being.
When I first went to counselling, I was in this kind of bubble. But after a few years of working with my project worker, she said to me, "You've been shining." And I said, "I think it's because of you. I've now got my confidence back."
The number one thing you can't do is bottle things up. You might want to, but it just doesn't help.
This place has made me feel more able to talk. The abuse was not my fault. Because of this place, I know that. Also, I know I'm not the only person who it happens to.
I think a year waiting list for support is too long. It shouldn't be any more than 3 months, because after that you give up hope.
If I had to give messages to other young people, I would say, speak out, because you're not alone. It's going to be a bit of a bumpy road ahead. There's going to be twists and turns, but make sure they believe in themselves.
Dreadful IT skills. I'm going to get Siobhan to get me back out of that to the slides. I know that's slightly wider than criminal justice, but actually it feels in really important context, because this is what children and young people are going through when they are then going through the criminal justice process, which is another layer on top of that. So I just want to start, we're going to kind of go through some key stages of the process and what they told us, but I want to start with some overarching findings. And the first thing to say is it is not all doom and gloom. There are some examples of promising practice. And actually, really encouragingly, in the later studies we have done more recently, we are getting more examples of promising practice. So we are going on a good journey in the right direction. And where there are those things, they are immensely valued by children and young people. They talk about it so much, the difference it makes. But it is inconsistently experienced. There's a real variation in children and young people's experiences across different police forces, within different police forces, from one police officer to the other, from one court to the other. There is just change and inconsistency. And when we talk to children and young people about their experiences, it's rare that the process was wholly negative or wholly positive. They could draw out experience of it that kind of spoke to both. But the reality is, in an adversarial legal system, the process is inherently difficult and traumatic. And it has multiple ripple effects on all other areas of their life. And we'll touch on that as we go through. But the key message came through time and time again is the actions of professionals are really important. So they can actually unnecessarily compound the difficulty, just make it worse. Or actually, although they never are to the extent of alleviating the difficulty, they can go a long way to help offset the difficulty of the process. And a really key message across all of the studies from young people has been small actions can make a big difference. And yes, whole system change, I would love it, bring it on. But in the meantime, small changes make a real difference. And that project that I talked about at the start, Marginal Gains, that the young people in police created a poster, they chose that name. My lack of sporting activity, apparently it's a sporting term about kind of, see, some people know what it is, about kind of these gradual steps really making a difference. And they chose that because they really recognised the importance of those small things that you can do. But overall, there is a real disjoint between policy and practice. And actually, sometimes you say about, we've done research with children and young people, and there's a bit of, oh, right, what do they want? Well, you know, we're not going to be able to do it. You know, there can be that, they'll want something completely unrealistic. Absolutely not. The vast majority of their asks of how you could make things better for them are feasible within recommended policies and guidance. In fact, it goes so far as to say they are already recommended. They are just not consistently being experienced. So they kind of have relevance for how we're operating within our existing frameworks. But also, and it's really lovely to be speaking to you at a time of real momentum and development around this, where we have Barnahus in Ireland, and I'm going to be evaluating that with Emma Herwood over the next kind of 6 months. Where we have child legal advisors introduced here in the north, where people are looking at expedited timeframes for children. There are developments, but that doesn't mean that the messages we hear don't apply anymore. There are still really important read across to this. And I suppose because today I'm focusing on how do we do it better, the things children and young people want us to change, it might feel a bit like, oh, it's all doom and gloom, and do you know what? It's not like that. We do things better. This is not about denying good practice, but it is about shining a light on where we need to extend it and to mainstream it. And I fundamentally believe that until all children and young people get our best offer, we have still work to do, no matter how far down the journey we are. So that's the context for what I'm going to share today. Generally speaking, there is an absence of trauma-informed, child-centred and rights-respecting practice. And I particularly pull out 4 rights here that we'll touch on as we go through the talk. Protection from harm, recovery and reintegration, expression and consideration of views, and the best interests of the child. And these are repeatedly compromised in children and young people's experiences of going through criminal justice processes. There's also, when you listen to their accounts, there's a potential conflict between justice and recovery needs, and a real failure to actually recognise the relationship between victim care and case progression and successful outcomes. Because actually, if you invest in support and well-being of children and young people, and you do the process as well, they are more likely to stay engaged. They're more likely to be able to give their best evidence. But in the absence of that, what children and young people often tell us is there is a frequent absence of a sense of justice. So they go through these processes and they are left feeling, where was the justice in that? And actually what's really interesting is because when you ask why did they go through it in the first place, justice is what was driving their engagement. And yet they go through this process and at the end often feel that justice is far beyond their grasp. So it leads me to ask the question, and I think it's always really important for us to bear in mind of, in every given case, is engagement in criminal justice systems actually the best way forward for that child? How else can justice be realised? I think we really need to kind of lean into potential changes in the system where we reduce the reliance on a child's testimony and we look at kind of securing convictions through greater reliance on other evidential means, and therefore taking the real weight off a child as it currently stands. So for the rest of the session, I'm going to think about kind of this journey that children go through. Now, in the middle here in a big box, we have CJS, the criminal justice system, and one might think that that's all I will talk about today. That would make sense. But actually, the pre-engagement and the post-engagement are massively important to children and young people. So they want you to think about what those bits mean, as well as when they are directly involved in the criminal justice system. You'll see there's kind of 5 key things that they talk about repeatedly around the criminal justice system that we'll look at. But I really cannot emphasize enough the impacts on their wider life as well. So significant impacts on family, significant impacts on friendship, significant impacts on their education, and massively significant well-being impacts on their well-being, their mental health. And so we need to kind of think about this holistically as opposed to just engagement in the criminal justice process. I did initially have this at the end, but then I thought, well, sure, it's helpful to put it at the start so you're aware of the themes that are going to be coming up. And there are consistent themes. The difficulty of the ask that we put on children and young people when we ask them to engage in criminal justice processes, professional attitudes, the importance of attending to well-being needs, communication, choice and control, consistency of personnel, not one size fits all. And in that wonderful video they talked, the goo goo gaga came up. And actually this is a really consistent message from older young people about really feeling quite patronised by the system and how alienating that can be. So it has to kind of be developmentally appropriate. Process improvement, there is no doubt process improvement is needed, particularly around duration of cases and delay. And then also just in the back of their heads, always this question of justice. So we'll take a wee look through the journey. I feel I need to apologise to the children and young people who took part in the work because I've already really struggled to get this into the time span, and I feel I had to leave out so much important stuff, but I've tried to just kind of pull out some of the key stuff. The detail of it all is in the research reports that are all open access. So pre-engagement is incredibly important in terms of a number of different things. One of them is recognising the different contexts of reporting. And for some of the children and young people we met, they had chosen to tell someone what was going on. They had chosen to go to the police around it. For many others, it was an accidental disclosure and their hand had been forced. And actually, we know from wider research around disclosure that forced disclosure, when not handled well, can actually be potentially damaging for children and young people. And so whichever route they came into significantly impacted how they experienced coming into the criminal justice process. So, for example, someone whose school found out said, well, I'm giving you to tomorrow to tell your parents, but we're phoning the police tomorrow morning if your parents haven't done it before then. That young person really felt her hand was forced, and she was forced into a process that she didn't want to take part in at all. And actually this kind of thing of things being reported to the police really positively for some, particularly younger children, talk about it being a route to safety. The bad man being put away and the police are there to protect people. But actually, the reality is that for some young people, it can also be a source of additional harm. So either because of the perpetrator, and I'll put some quotes up here, either because of kind of what the perpetrator is going to do to them because the police have now found out, other people's reactions and other people's reaction and people finding out what's happened to you was a massive issue for the children and young people we spoke to, but also the traumatic and distressing parts of system engagement. And sadly, a real sense of failure at different parts of the system and feeling let down by it. So throughout it, I'm going to share young people's quotes because I think it's best you hear from them. They're all different quotes from the different research. It was personally at the beginning very hysterical because that is something that I'd kept to myself for a long time. And now everything's changing. And I think sometimes we can think about, you know, the kind of distress being just of, oh, it's just happened, you're reporting. Actually, it can be as strong because I've kept this buried for so long and suddenly it's coming out. And all of these things meant there was really significant fear and anxiety about what this process might entail for them. As another one said, I was scared because my rapist said, never tell the police because I'll kill your family. So I was petrified for my family. And these are not, they're not saying it of, oh, well, they told me that, but they're not going to do it. They genuinely think this is going to be done. A real fear of not being believed. I was scared it wouldn't get anywhere. No one would believe me. Oh, sorry, I can see my spacing's all gone a bit skew with. What evidence would they even find? And then another young person said, well, actually, it's just engaging with the police in and of itself. You know, you feel like you're in trouble. The police were made for people that were causing trouble. So there are so many reasons that actually there's a real fear and anxiety even before the process kicks off, when you know it might happen, that it is so important to be mindful of. And they're kind of one of their key things, as we had in the box, was understanding the difficulty of the ask of what this means for young people. Now, that's the case generally, but what we need to recognise is that for some young people, this may actually be on top of existing negative experiences of having engaged with police before, reported something, it didn't go anywhere, or not being believed, or of other services, negative kind of service intervention. Somebody finds out what's happened, everybody comes in and swoops in, and your life's out of your control. And also in the context of general distrust of the police. So when we're doing this in London, Black young males have had, understandably, a very heightened distrust of the police. And I think particularly as we look at all the stuff that's been coming out around the police, Sarah Everard, etc., that general mistrust in the police is actually quite widespread. So first contacts are inherently difficult. These are the contexts in which they happen. They know it involves talking about the abuse, either which is just raw because it's only just happened, or actually being so deeply buried that it can feel completely overwhelming when it comes out. One young person that we met in the most recent study that we did last year talked about actually ending up in hospital when she thought about this coming out, because she just had a total emotional collapse because of this. The detail required, this isn't a general, I'm alluding to you, something has happened. You're having to go through the detail of the most distressing experience of your life. And it may be to multiple strangers. And I know in the video, the young people there said about it does get easier after the first one. Absolutely true. But the other message from young people is there has to be a limit to how many people you have to keep telling the same information to. We also see a kind of, within a lot of kind of officers who are first responding, because they're not specialists, a lack of understanding of trauma. And interestingly, I was doing a training day for police around young people's experiences, and I was saying something like this, and we had oh, well, you know, maybe in the past, but actually we've been training people and, you know, that doesn't really happen anymore. Phone goes, the person, the kind of senior police officer leaves, comes back in and goes, okay, so that phone call I've just taken, they used the phrase, but she's not acting like she's been raped. So we might think we are in a better place, but actually we still have all these assumptions and biases, the belief as to what, and basically what they meant is she doesn't look distressed, she's not crying, she's not falling to pieces. But of course, with any understanding of trauma, we know that the shutdown is also a trauma response. But actually that is hiding the harm that young people are experiencing. Sorry, with the cold, my throat is getting very dry. There's also a real theme around variable experiences of first contact, partly due to the individual officer, partly actually due to the biography and the experiences of the child. And certainly older children reported more negative experiences. Children who'd had prior engagement with the police, for example, reported for going missing. I hate that phrase, but it is what it is. Or kind of in the context of abuse where maybe they've had kind of previous experiences. We also see that there were particular types and situations of abuse that seem to elicit more negative responses from the police, and particularly around harm that was experienced by peers. Young people repeatedly told us that actually there was a bit of a kind of minimization of it, and well, was it really? You know, it's one of the quotes here, kind of the second quote, said this was in the case of multiple perpetrator rape of this young person who was 14, and said they asked me questions like, do you like sex? And then talking about themselves and what they did when they were young. It's written in the making her feel, because sometimes we use third person in vignettes to kind of as an easy read into this, making her feel she's not the victim, it's her fault. It made the girl want to give up about the case in her investigation. She was talking about her own experience, and the message she took from that encounter was, all you're hearing is this is my first sexual experience. You're not hearing that this is a sexual assault. And we do the repeated things that in that peer context, that the level of harm actually isn't always being recognised. And I think there's a really interesting tension here, because of course in the case of HSB we still want a child first approach for that child, but the harm experienced by the other child is no less significant than if the person was 19. So there's real tensions. I think we have to, and we're looking at trying to get a piece of research of this to kind of look at how do we grapple these tensions. Because certainly kind of statistics show up, the recent MPCC ones, there were gaps in the data, but we're saying one in two cases are now peer on peer. You know, so this is something we've got to engage with, but which are historically getting worse responses. As I say, having been going missing, you know, that kind of sense of we don't always use the putting yourself at risk language. We still hear it, but it's still, you know, that even if the language isn't used, the sentiment behind it is still there. Or you shared images, you know, and just this kind of sense of always kind of being doubted, or, well, you know, you're somehow to blame if you hadn't done that. It's not said in words, but young people are acutely attentive of the non-verbal or the what's not being said. One here just saying the police had the tone in their voice. She kept saying to me, if you're lying, you've got to tell me. Well, of course, she's basically then the young person saying, you just think I'm lying about the whole thing. There is a massive need, and children and young people talk about this, for respectful, they don't necessarily use this language, non-judgmental, caring engagements. These first encounters have to get better, consistently better, and for all. No matter the age of the child, no matter their history, no matter whether prior police engagement, no matter whether it's by peers or it's by a group of people in their 50s, it has to be better for all. And the young people talk here about you can just tell when someone's not just doing their job, but they have the empathy as well as the care. And that repeatedly came out. They knew if you were more than a case to them. Then we have the two kind of extremes, you know, one kind of talking about considering the nature of the case, he wasn't very empathetic. He was just getting straight facts. And this is actually a very young child who was experiencing this. And on the other hand, somebody reflecting recently, they were really nice. They were kind of taking things slowly, trying to get the information that I knew. They were really calm. And this is really important. We talked about choice, saying things like, if you want, we can turn off our body cam. Or saying to someone, another person talked about, you know, they were doing okay at first and then they started to be asked the detail and they kind of were really embarrassed and not saying as much. And the police officer cottoned on, it's their parents were in the room and said, would you like your parents to be outside? Would you be more comfortable? And yes. So thinking about the choice and how you can ease what is a difficult process. But the other reality of this is when this gets reported, when police get involved, you lose control of what happens. Your privacy can be really undermined. And that can be things through police presence. They talked about, well, you know, they turned up, they weren't in uniform, but these two people who looked like police officers walked into the school, met me, and then everybody's like, what's happened to her, or what she's done, or what's he done? So that whole sense of people starting to talk about it. The example here of police turning up at the door and her parents kind of finding out. Sorry, I read the wrong example there. The other one about kind of being in full uniforms. And yet when they'd phoned, they specifically said, don't come in uniform, don't come in a marked car, because the father who was the abuser lived next door. And actually the risk escalated because suddenly they knew it had just been reported. So police presence can actually escalate risk. Information sharing can escalate risk. We know information has to be shared, but a really significant theme for children and young people is handle their information carefully. Share what you need to share, but don't carelessly share with other people who don't need to know this. Schools, for example, they talked about everybody in the school. The teachers all know this happened to me. And yes, whilst it's good for the school to know to support me, they don't all need to know, and all I can feel is they're just looking at me going, oh, that's who you are now, that's what's happened to you. And also kind of these associated risks. And I think for me, this analogy is quite visual for me. The police turned up at the door, the parents found out it was literally a dam breaking and the water flooding. That is how overwhelming and loss of control that this can feel. So there is the real massive potential for overwhelm in terms of this, but there's also a massive potential for overwhelm in terms of the number of things that suddenly kick in that need to be done once the immediate reporting is. They talked about that feeling overwhelmed, the ask of them feeling very overwhelming. So the importance of pacing, the importance of explaining and re-explaining. So it's not enough to say, well, I told them that once, because if you're in the middle of a state of trauma, you're not taking in the detail of what's being said. So re-explanation and choice wherever possible. This is a system whereby they do not naturally have choice, but as you'll see as we go through, there are lots of ways in which you can build in small choice. No surprise, the next big thing that young people focused on was video recorded, or is also called frequently in England, achieving best evidence interviews. Now, what's really interesting is it's not that many were going, they really shouldn't happen, because actually they understood for a case to go forward that the detail needed to happen. But I mean, I could have filled slides upon slides with quotes around these. The anxiety, the fear, the embarrassment, and the distress of this. Even stepping into that room, I was already shaking. You know what's about to come. You have to literally explain everything down to a T. And obviously, being a teenager, it was a bit embarrassing talking to a random person about it. They don't even know how it feels. They're asking lots of questions about him. And this was a younger child saying it made them really angry, you know. So it's not kind of, it can be lots of different emotions. And as we saw the reference in the video, that was more traumatizing than the abuse I went through. It was literally like the abuse going on again, the whole thing happening again. And so, yes, the evidence needs to be captured, but actually we need to really recognise how difficult this is for children and the ways in which we can start to ease the process. Some of that is practical. Children shared examples of partway through, they realised the recording wasn't working, and so they had to go over things again. You know, so there's kind of real practical preparation that needs to be done, but preparation also with the child or young person. So the really good examples being shared were the young person saying, yeah, no, I mean, the interview was a bit horrible, but actually they came and met me first. They explained what was going to happen. They took me into the room. They took me and showed me what happened behind the screens, where the camera was. I met the person who was going to be doing that. So that demystifying of this process, because actually that you don't know who's behind that camera was a really significant thing for children and young people. This kind of hidden recording is what it felt like. And I get that it's to try to not be intimidated by having a camera in the room, but actually it's really quite undermining of their sense of control of what's going on. So explaining that, planned use of information, who will see it, when will it be showed, how can they see it, and also really practically attention to physical space. And some people talked about, you know, the kind of the softness of the furniture, and it was like my therapy room, and that felt really comfortable. Others were just like, I felt like it was the dingiest place I've ever been, and it was like being in a jail, and, you know. And this isn't simply about whether it's in a police station or not, because actually some people, the police came and did it in schools, and the young people didn't like that. Now, some did. So it's back to the point of there is no one size fits all. But actually, you can talk to the child or young person and their supporters around what is preferable for that individual child. They massively appreciated demonstrations of care, practical and emotional, particularly around the VRI interview, and kind of consideration. And interestingly, this came out more recently, the encouragement bit, which I hadn't thought about. So just practically, they'll ask, are you okay? Do you feel okay to do it? Do you want to reschedule? And stuff like this. They'll offer you a drink and stuff just to try to make it as least scary as possible. And I think that's the phrase, isn't it? It's not going to not be scary, but as least scary as possible. And then someone specifically talked about the praise part of it, and then that connected, and we looked back and realised that's also a theme. It's the praise side of it as well, and knowing that you're not alone. I think that was a really important thing that they said. You've done so well. Thank you for sharing this. That really makes a difference. So again, it's back to that. They recognised the difficulty of the ask, and they were able to kind of thank the child for actually what they were able to do. Really interesting. There was virtually 10 minutes, virtually no reference to any choice being offered around VRI interviews. And young people talked about wanting choice around gender, wanting choice about where it took place, who did them, but there were only small numbers who actually have this. And one of the key things that came up was young people saying about having wanted a supporter in the room, but it being denied. And actually it doesn't need to be denied. But the number of young people who said they were told, well, you can't, they can be next door and they'll be there when you finish, but you can't have them in the room. So this is what I mean. It is not that this can't be done under policy. It is just not always being done in reality. And just as a slight side note about the wanted supporters in the room, I also just want to kind of illustrate the point about the sense of responsibility that young people can feel for their family and their parents. Because one who'd wanted their parent in and was told not, then reflected back and said, you know, but actually it maybe wasn't a bad thing, because that would have been really hard for them to hear. And so this sense of, it was really hard for me to do it on my own, but at least it protected my mum. So they're carrying this burden not only of what they're going through, but the impact on other people. I have called this point the waiting game, because I think someone specifically used the phrase, but that was kind of the repeated notion that got shared. And that's the point from when you've done that initial interview or anything else kind of initially that needs done evidentially. Mobile phones being taken off, massive issue, and not being given back for delayed time, massive issue. But between that and then actually a case outcome or knowing that it's going to court was this period whereby there might be stuff going on behind the scenes, and you're all probably very aware of what's going on behind the scenes if you're working in the system. But to the young person, it's just this massive long period that it feels like nothing's happening. It felt like forever. Another young person saying, I'm just naturally discouraged by the silence and the amount of time it's taken. I'm actually pretty worried. I'm just waiting. I'm not sure if everyone involved is being effective because I've heard nothing. So you might be doing your best, but if they don't know that, they're left with this sense of, have you just forgotten about me? And someone else saying that, I felt confused and sad because I felt like they just forgot me, basically. Another one more positively talking about the officer very much telling them what was going on, what was going to happen next. They always knew what was doing, and that was nice for them. So there are procedural issues about the period of time here that need to be addressed. It is a long time for anyone. It is a particularly long time in a child's life, kind of when they're going through kind of key transitions and developmental stages. And as I said, they are still doing life alongside this. They're still trying, I was going to say their O-levels, I'm going to show me age there. They're still trying to do their GCSEs or their O-levels, or they're transitioning to university or an apprenticeship. I mean, these big life things are going on, and this is still kind of hovering for them. And it's experienced as a real period of uncertainty, inaction, and silence. So the key message they keep saying is, it's so important to keep in touch. It's so important to keep them updated. And they talk about, even if you've nothing new to tell me, just get in touch. So I know you haven't forgotten about me, that my case is still being taken seriously and worked on. It's also really important, particularly for older children, that we give them choice as to how they receive these updates. So a number talked like this one of, they talked to my dad, but as they said, well, I'm the one, it happened to. But actually they just by default gave the updates to the dad. And we do have to recognise that this kind of periodically hearing can bring things up again. You know, it can cause upset if you're like, oh, well, we've nothing new to tell you from last month, we're still. But actually, as they said, it's always in the back of their head anyway. And then when you weigh them up in balance, they would rather be being contacted and being kept up to date and knowing they are still kind of in your mind. Really big issue. I had consistency earlier on. Unplanned, unmanaged personnel changes. And it's not that they only happen at this stage, but that there were lots of it during this stage because of the duration of it. And I just think for me, this says it all. Every time my case got swapped to a different officer, it felt like the previous one was giving up on me. Now, what message does that give a child? If actually their sense is, oh, it was too hard, you weren't getting anywhere, you've moved on, somebody else will pick it up. Really important that we really attend to consistency of personnel where we can. We also need to recognise that there may actually be increased safety, lack of safety issues that should actually be during this time. So they talked about during this period, people being released on bail. They talked about bail conditions being relaxed or NFA decisions kind of happening at this case, but actually not always being told. So suddenly they talked about, suddenly there he was walking down the street. I thought he couldn't do that, or he's coming up to my house and you're not responding like you said you would. So there's a real kind of safety issues as well can emerge in this time. And I talked about the kind of peer perpetrator earlier on, real issue around how you manage that, particularly, and there are a lot of cases where the two children are still in the same school together. And actually where they are literally going in day and daily and sitting in the same room. And that's why I think we need this piece of work looking at the tensions of essentially when do two children's rights clash and how do we actually manage this. And kind of then dealing 5 minutes, perfect. Dealing with the decisions, the eventual decisions, the NFA in particular. You go through all of this, having to relive what happened through your interviews for them to turn around and say, nah, we're not going to take it any further. I know it wouldn't be put quite like that. Devastating, just devastating. And so what really came across clearly is, A, yes, the decisions are really important, the outcomes are really important, but so is the explanation. So for example, if the decision is only to charge for lesser offences because there isn't the evidence for the sexual offences, the explanation of why, because otherwise what they hear, all right, drug dealing's worse than me being raped, that's what you're going to prosecute them for. So it's not just the decision, it's the explanation and the communication as to why that is the case. It is so important. I said, okay, for 5 minutes, but I'm going to have to quickly rush. So important to attend to wellbeing, obviously at all stages, but continuing this. This may be a professional's job, but it's one part of their life and they're trying to get on with it, but this is all still hovering over them at the same time. I talked about the real impacts that it can have and the concern for parents. This second quote, feeling bad for my mum, it's not just me who's going through it. This is an 8-year-old child who is, when we are talking about her experiences, talking about her worry for her mum. And a real issue we need to crack is getting access to pre-trial therapy. Because although it is permissible, although the guidelines changed in England in 2022, making it even more permissible, children are still being told that they can't have it. And they really, so basically they are potentially being left for 2 years with no support to manage the impact of the abuse, people's reactions to the abuse, the impact of going through the criminal justice system. We have to do that. We have to get better also in linking into other support, CHISVAs or ISVA, child ISVAs or ISVAs, because they really value them when they got it. And one of the studies that we did was about children's experiences of the Lighthouse model in London, the Child House model. They really valued that under one roof approach of feeling held all in one place. So no surprise, courts are the final things that they chose to talk about. It's a vile place. It's such a vile, vile place. It's like there are no boundaries and they don't care what age you are, what has gone on. They don't care and they will do as much as they can to let abusers get away with stuff. And the experience I had with the trial, it scarred me even more. I've never felt so degraded in my life. These are not atypical statements of the experience of the minority of cases that actually make it to court. It's another incredibly distressing stage for children. Really high levels of fear and anxiety, which are exacerbated by the waiting times and particularly by the, you've been told you're going that day, oh, no, there's a last minute rescheduling, it's changed. Massive issue for children. They're themselves all psyched up for going and suddenly it's like, poof, and you have to do it all over again. And it talks here about that moving 1,000 miles an hour pre-court as well. It feels it's going to be forever and then suddenly you get really panicky and it's really overwhelming. Really mixed experiences of being prepared for court. Some really good experiences, some got very little, weren't offered at all. But loads of difficulties around going to court. No surprise, seeing the perpetrator again, watching the VRI being shown, giving evidence, being cross-examined, open courts, so courts not always being cleared when children are due to give evidence, even though that's what's meant to be happening under special measures. Press reporting, actually for older children, a real issue around press reporting, even if you're not named. Well, people in the community can figure out that that's me. And even the duration of the trial in and of itself. And even young children reported really humiliating, distressing, undermining lines of questioning. They try to twist and turn it around, so you're the bad one and they're the innocent one. Barristers are snakes. They're not very, apology to any barristers watching it, they're not very nice people, the way they act. It's a way that you've never experienced before. And another one, I was going on about him pulling down my pants and stuff when they were age 7, and he was like, did you like it? I know they're trying to do their jobs, but it's inhuman. It's a kind of sick question. And so, yes, we have initiatives that are underway to try to manage this, which is great, but children are still having these really negative experiences. And there's a particular issue here around special measures. And yes, special measures come in earlier in the process, but the reality of them landing is experienced at this point in time. And there are lots of what I would suspect well-intended decisions made about what special measures should be applied, but they're not always in the best interest of the child, or they're not always aligned actually with their preferences and wishes. And it's like we keep going to the same ones, and the full range of them actually aren't used. And I just want to highlight an example to illustrate how significant this is. In one of our studies, court happened, unsurprisingly, a number of years later. In that interim period, she had totally changed her appearance so that the people who had abused her wouldn't recognise her. She was told about video link. It wasn't explained that she could be seen. And so she turned up thinking she meant she was giving the evidence. They couldn't see her, and suddenly realised that all this protective work that she had done over the last few years in one split second was gone. So important that we explain the options, the reality of special measures, and work out what is better for that child. I've put this in because people may ask about registered intermediaries, very little reference to them with the young people we have met. However, positively, I'm going to one wrap-up slide after that. Really positive examples also shared, particularly recently, that we wouldn't have seen before. Someone talking about sharing with me how distressed they were in the kind of video evidence room. And actually the judge and the barristers, including the defence barrister, taking off their wigs, coming down and saying, you know, I realise this is really difficult, and actually really trying to humanise the experience. And judges, examples of judges kind of tightly managing lines of questions and giving kind of direction, judicial direction, etc., as well as what should be considered and not considered. So we are seeing some good examples. And obviously then the impact of the verdict and sentencing. And occasionally that's relief, but more often that is distress. You can see this court is shit, nothing gets done. I wouldn't have done any of this shit if I knew the outcome. I had faith in the court, the police and everything. And as soon as they turned around and said he's walked, that was it. I was devastated. And since then, I've never trusted the law. And we talked earlier about people getting more time for doing drugs than rapists. So it can strongly undermine their faith in justice. But there's a really interesting tension here, because equally when you say we do things like, what advice would you give another child or young person? They don't always want to put them off, because they want them to have their chance to get justice as well, even if they haven't experienced it. And the aftermath, I totally lied about having one. I'm sorry, I have 2 slides. Young people talk about the system ends, the attention ends, the support ends. And actually, this can just be the really difficult period, because you don't have the thing you're focusing on. It's all gone away. And then suddenly it's just overwhelming. And they talk here about, you know, the relief and then the dip, being left to handle it on your own. So it is so important when we think about support that we think about the continuation of support while the impacts of what have happened still goes on. And this is actually my last slide, so sorry about that. In summary, as one young child that I met said, you know, what advice would you give police or courts, you know, judges or barristers? This is not just any other case you do. It is a factual thing, but it's a lot of emotional trauma too. So in essence, it's about maintaining humanity in the system. Young people want to feel like more than a case to you, not one size fits all, being able to kind of, you know, respond differently to evolving capacity, actively countering abusive power dynamics. We know abuse is kind of, it's all about the control and the choice of other and not you. And yes, it can feel like in the system you can't build that in, but there's examples of police saying, well, something else came up, I was due to meet them, but I had to go and deal with this urgent call that came in. I couldn't offer any choice. And said, well, you can, okay. So you could say, here's what's happened, back to the importance of explanation. Either somebody else can come and see you at that time, because I now have to do this, or we can reschedule. So always small ways you can build this in, and recognise the enormity of the task and the importance of mitigating and supporting that. And in essence, good practice needs to become less dependent on individuals and more systemically embedded. Greater use of system features that are designed to support child victims that are not being used. And I guess my last plea to you is embed opportunities to learn from children and young people if you're working in the system. Don't rely on us doing the research. Every time we engage children and young people, as young as 6 as we had in this, they can tell you what you need to hear if you ask them in the right way. So make this part of your process. Apologies for running on. That is me done. Thanks.